This talk I gave at Renmin University of China, Renmin as part of the World Conference of Classics, in particular the panel on philology and the translation and exegesis of classics. That was on the 8th of November, 2024. Since the talk wasn't recorded, I decided maybe I'll record a version for you now. So the talk is Literary Style in a Tibetan Classic. I'll begin by giving you a little overview of the talk. So first, I will talk you through the particular passage of the story from the Milarepa rnamthar that I'll be talking about, and then I will give a few points on the literary style and the issues in translation or approaches to translation that we see in the translations I discuss. Okay, so first, an introduction to the text and its translations. So we're talking today about the Milarepa rnamthar, or the Life of Milarepa, one of the most famous classics of Tibetan literature. It's a biography of a renowned 11th century Tibetan yogi and poet, but it was written in the 15th century by Tsangnyön Heruka Rupa Genchen, and it narrates Milarepa's journey from a life of sin to spiritual enlightenment through intense ascetic practice. So it's been translated many times, actually, but I'm going to look at three of the most prominent translations into Western languages. So those are the translation by Jacques Bacot from the 1920s, Lobsang Lhalungpa in the 1970s, and Andrew Quintman in 2010. First, I should just give a little bit of background in the story. So Milarepa's father was a wealthy merchant, but he died when Milarepa was still a boy. And then Milarepa's uncle and aunt were given custody of him until he reached majority, although his mother was still alive. And then the aunt and uncle basically treated Milarepa and his mother and his younger sister like servants in their own household. And then what happened was that when Milarepa reached majority, his mother arranged a feast to request the return of his patrimony. Okay, so this is the scene from the feast. So here I'm just going to read the story in Quintman's translation, and you can follow along in the Tibetan if you're able to. So my mother then stood up in the middle of the guests who were seated in a row and said, "All right then, when a child is born, he is named. When beer is poured, there is talk. I also have a few words to say." Elders seated here in a row, headed by aunt and uncle, you who know of my husband Milarepa Gyaltsen's testament, proclaimed at the time of his passing, please listen closely. My maternal uncle then read the text of my father's testament. When he finished, my mother said, "Since the meaning of this text and its proclamation is clear to all the elders seated here, there is no need for me to recount it at length." Briefly stated, up to now, both uncle and aunt have looked after me and my children with utmost care. Now, as my son and Zese, that's the son's, let's say, betrothed, as my son and Zese are able to support their own family, I ask that you return our wealth that was entrusted to you, that my son marry Zese, and that he take possession of his patrimony in accordance with his father's testament. And then that's the end of her speech. My uncle and aunt never agreed with one another, but they were reconciled in their greed, and I was an only son, while my uncle had many sons. My uncle and aunt were thus united and said, "You have possessions? Where are they?" Previously, when Milarepa Gyaltsen was in good health, we loaned him a house, field, gold, turquoise, crossbred yaks, horses, yaks, and sheep. When he died, these possessions were returned to their owner. Do you own a single piece of gold, a handful of barley, a single lump of butter, A single silken robe, even a single she-goat? We never saw any of these. And yet you speak like this. Who wrote the text of your testament? We were good enough to sustain you truly miserable creatures, so you did not starve to death. But it is as the saying goes, when wicked men are granted power, they will measure out water by the ladleful. So that's the end of their speech. My uncle blew his nose and suddenly rose from his seat. He snapped his fingers, shook the hem of his cloak, and stomped his foot. He then said, what is more, even this house belongs to us, so you and your children get out. And he slapped my mother with his hand and struck my sister and me with the length of his sleeve. At that point, my mother cried, "Oh, Father Milarepa Galtson, look at the fate of your wife and children. You who said, I shall watch you from my grave. The time has come to look down upon us." She fell on the floor weeping and rolled back and forth on the ground. My sister and I could do nothing for her but weep. Those of our countrymen who were sympathetic towards us expressed their empathy for mother and child, and not one among them failed to weep. The rest sighed deeply. Then uncle and aunt said to us, you say that you need your possessions, but you already have many things. You have laid out a feast for your neighbors and countrymen without regard for the meat and beer that you squandered. Your possessions, we don't have them. Even if we did, we wouldn't give them to you. So if you are many, make war. If you are few, cast magic. Having said this, they left. As my mother sat there weeping hysterically, all those sympathetic to us, such as my maternal uncle and Zesse's father and brothers, stayed behind to console her. They drank the remaining beer and said to my mother, don't cry. Crying won't help. All right, so first I'm going to discuss what I see as more or less straightforward mistranslations in the three translations that I have promised to talk about. So in the first category, we have Lhalungpa copying mistakes from Bacot. So if we look at this phrase, dun drilwala, it's simply omitted from Bacot and Lhalungpa's translations, whereas Quintman gives it as briefly stated. So the Tibetan dun drilwala is kind of quite literally something like in the meaning rolled up. Yeah, so I think Quintman has provided a good solution in English for this. All right, in the next one, we have this list of things that the aunt and uncle are asking about. And somehow barley has gone missing in the translations of Bacot and Lhalungpa. So they've got the gold, they've got the butter, they've got the garment, yeah, but no barley, no barley. So that's a mistake. And then also the silk robe, they have misanalyzed as two different items. So let's just look at the Tibetan phrase, Gu dar kyang na chik. So it's one kind of unit of some kind of silken garment. And that's how, Quintman then translates a silken robe, whereas Bacot says un seul vêtement, un seul lambeau de soie, and Lhalungpa says a single garment, a single scrap of silk. So they've analyzed it as somehow two different noun phrases. All right, and then in this case, we're looking at this Tibetan verb tongwa, which means to see, and the scope of the verb is captured correctly by Quintman. So if we look at this phrase in Tibetan, kyang mikki ma tongwa, so even these by the eye, we haven't seen, or something like that. So then the question is, what's the scope of what's being seen? So let's look at Bacot. We have this, nous n'avons même pas vu le sabot d'un animal. So it's only talking about the hoof of an animal, yeah? And then that's translated exactly the same way by Lhalungpa. So we have not even seen the hoof of an animal. Whereas Quintman lists everything, a silken robe, even a single she-goat, where that even is the kyang, yeah? And then he says, we never saw any of these, yeah? So the scope of the seeing is all of the preceding noun phrases. And I think that's correct, because there's no other, there's no other way of really construing the syntax. So that's another case where Lhalungpa has copied Bacot's mistake, this time a sort of syntactical question. So in general, Quintman definitely does the best of these two, but there are cases where Quintman adds mistakes of his own. So we're going to look at that next. Namely, this phrase, la dendra. So we're looking still at the same phrase. Quintman has the "we never saw any of these," and then he adds, "and yet you speak like this." Okay. So it is worth noting that Bacot and Lhalungpa just don't try to translate this la dendra. Yeah. Now the question is, are they doing that on purpose? Like, have they analyzed correctly what's going on and then decided not to translate it? It's possible, but it's also possible, based on some of the sloppy mistakes we've seen before, that they just didn't know how to handle it, so left it out. So I propose a translation, which is, they say blah blah blah, right? Do you possess a single piece of gold, etc., and things like that. So it's saying, this isn't really direct quotation. It's a kind of paraphrase. Now, why do I think that? Because of the placement of the phrase serwa. So serwa introduces or ends a quotation. So we have blah 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 mikima tongwa la dendra zerwa. So it means they said blah 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 and the like. The tong is nominalized, tongwa la dendra. So it must mean things like we have never seen. So Quintman's understanding of it is not possible. That's the point I'm trying to make. So we've seen places where Bacot and Lhalungpa make the same mistake, and then we've seen a place where Quintman makes a mistake. Now a innovation of Lhalungpa's, which I assume is kind of boglerizing the text. Yeah. So we have this humorous detail, which is that the allies of Milarepa and his mother stay to console her while drinking all of her beer. Yeah. So we have in Bacot, we have et buvons le reste de la bière, and then Quintman has they drank the remaining beer. So Lhalungpa just leaves this out, and maybe that was just an oversight on his part, but it also seems to me like it's it's a detail that's funny and that undermines sort of the hero's side, right? The allies are actually themselves not such good people, because they're taking advantage of Milarepa and his mother in this moment of weakness. So I can't help but wonder whether Lhalungpa decided to take that detail out. So next, I'm going to treat where none of the existing translations are, to my mind, correct, or at least they could be improved. And this is where we're a bit moving into questions of literary style. So let's look at these phrases that I've put in bold. So ngela nor guser nor kierang Lhalungpa. So then Bacot says, tu réclames tes biens, mais tu les as. And then Lhalungpa has, you demand your goods, but you already have a great deal. And then Quintman, you say that you need your possessions, but you already possess many things. And then I would say, you say you need money, you have money. Everyone adds some kind of conjunction, right? Mais or but. It's just two finite sentences. You say you need money, you have money. And I think that absence of a conjunction is actually consistent with the anger that's being expressed by the aunt and uncle. And then I'll also just say that, like, nor kierang ladu is just an extremely simple sentence. You have money, or you have wealth. So why are people over translating it by things like you already possess many things? You already have a great deal. And here you might see Quintman as being influenced by Lhalungpa's translation. And then the next one, Keginoram delang me. Your money, we don't have that. So now if we look at the translations, ce sont tes biens, ce n'est pas moi qui les ai. So there's several problems, including that it's translated as moi rather than nous. Then with Lhalungpa, we do not have such wealth. He takes two sentences and he smashes them together. And then Quintman has, your possessions, we don't have them. That's actually quite close. He's got the syntax right, the two questions. And then the only thing I guess I would say is I think possessions is over-translating nor, and that it's we don't have that. And here is a case where I believe all three translations have gotten something wrong. So let's look at the Tibetan. Olaso, bu kiepala ming, chang drangpala tam jawar dawe. So Bacot has, ou bien, quand fils est né, on lui donne un nom. Quand est convoqué à un festin de bière, cela veut dire causerie. Then Lhalungpa, when a son is born, he is given a name. When one is summoned to a beer feast, this means it's time to talk. I have something to say to all of you gathered here. Then Quintman, all right then. When a child is born, he is named. When beer is poured, there is talk. So I think these three translations really miss 2 points in this construction. One is the parallelism. Bu kiepa la ming, chang drangpa la tam. A newborn boy has a name, an invitation to drink has a speech. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, they translate all the words, but they sort of don't capture the parallelism in structure. And then also, I think that they don't translate the fact that this is in sort of quotes, right? This jawar means is quoting. You know, they say that name is to a newborn boy like a speech is to a banquet. And this is a very appropriate way to start a speech, right? And I think the other translations kind of get that, but not really. And the thing that kind of surprises me is that the most straightforward literal translation, I feel like, is also pragmatically speaking more appropriate than the existing translations. So here's another case where the literal translation, I think, is again more appropriate. So all three translators add a verb where there is none. So we'll just look at this, the end of this part. Keginoram te kangna yupayin. So, vous avez des biens, où sont-ils? And you have goods, where are they? You have possessions, where are they? So the question is just keginor, your wealth. So I translate here as wealth. Where is it? I think that this question with no verb in it, again, shows how angry the aunt and uncle are. So they just are saying, your wealth? Where's that? Yeah. So to translate it with a verb is to kind of reduce the emotional tension, if you like, that's actually in the text. Now, in this example, the word tangpo, which according to the dictionaries means first, is kind of, again, over-translated by the other translators. So Bacot does it as autrefois, and then Lhalungpa, again, very closely following Bacot, says in former times, and then Quintman, perhaps influenced by this tradition, says previously. But why not just say first? First, when Mila Sheriff Gelson was in good health, we loaned him blah blah blah. When he died, yeah, I think there's a clear like one point in time, another point in time. So first is fine. It works just fine. So now I'm going to move on from kind of strictly speaking translation issues to more general stylistic comments. The mother uses long sentences in her speech, and this is something that the translators correctly get. I want to point out these elements of literary style in the text. So we have this: elders seated here in a row, headed by uncle and aunt. You who know my husband Milarepa Galston's testament proclaimed at the time of his passing, please listen closely. So a very long sentence with a certain amount of subordination, appropriate for giving a speech at a dinner party. And then we contrast with the very short sentences said by the uncle and aunt when they're really angry. So they say, do you own a single piece of gold, a handful of barley, a single lump of butter? And each of these is, syntactically a separate sentence. So very short sentences. Now, another feature of the mother's speech is this extensive use of honorifics. Now, you can't really translate this into English very well. You could into Japanese, for instance. But we have this dawe, lakpa, these very elegant verbs, and then these honorifics: ze, du, juk, sit, nien, senpar, for listen. So when she's addressing her guests. And here's just a couple more examples of honorifics. So dir ju, seated here. Mi par da, there's no need, with this very elegant copula verb. And then another feature of the text that I think is interesting from a literary style perspective is, in their anger, the aunt and uncle can't keep their story straight. So they say both, you have no money, so you have possessions, where are they? Yeah. And then they also say, you have plenty of money. So they say, you have laid out a feast for your neighbors and countrymen without regard for the meat and beer that you squandered. So this shows that they're so caught off guard by the front of this speech that the mother has given, that even in their attempt to react to it, they're quite inconsistent. And I think that's a nice feature of the text to reveal how angry the aunt and uncle are. And just by way of conclusion, then I'll say translators often seem to avoid the most straightforward solution, although it actually works best from a literary perspective. And in particular, in the case of Lhalungpa relying on Bacot, we see a kind of overly deferential attitude to previous translations. But in some ways, we've also seen that Quintman may have been unduly influenced by his predecessors, and that somehow, because translators feel like it's their job to make something more accessible, maybe they make changes where it's unnecessary. Even from the perspective of literary style, it makes things worse. That's let's say the overall conclusion I wanted to make is, I'm surprised to see that translators sometimes reach past the obvious answer, even when that obvious answer would work linguistically, in terms of an accurate translation, but also work stylistically. And unfortunately, I think that this approach of translators, maybe especially from Tibetan, means that there's a tendency in translations from Tibetan to flatten the elements of the text that capture the literary style of the author. So thank you very much for listening.